Hey everyone, welcome to the Blue Bench podcast. Today on the show, we're talking immigration, specifically immigration in the Flathead area. Rebecca Miller and Johnny Ratka Skinner join us from Valley Neighbors of Flathead. We'll talk about how their organization supports immigrants in the Flathead area and about the recent arrest and detention of a Venezuelan man in Whitefish who was pulled over for a headlight being out. He was here legally. We'll learn more about this incident and the Valley Neighbors of Flathead's advocacy work coming up. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Blue Bench Podcast. My name is Gabby Crevitt. I'm the Communications Director with the Montana Democratic Party. Today, we're joined by Rebecca Miller and Johnny Ratka Skinner, both the chair and a board member of Valley Neighbors of Flathead, a nonprofit organization dedicated to connecting immigrants to resources in the Flathead area and equipping communities to provide resources for immigrants. Thank you both for being on the show today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So today we want to ask you about topics surrounding immigration in the Flathead community. Obviously, it's become a highly politicized issue, but we want to know what's happening in the Flathead area. We learned back in April a Venezuelan man was arrested by federal agents in Whitefish and detained. He was here legally, so we'll definitely be asking you about that particular incident. But I first wanted to ask you about Valley Neighbors of Flathead. Can you tell me a little bit about the organization?
Sure. Yeah, we became a nonprofit in 2021. Prior to that time, there was discussion groups that would gather together and local people who wanted to learn more about immigration and about the things they were seeing on TV and how they could make a positive impact on the people they saw suffering in the world. And so we formed as a nonprofit in 2021, welcomed a first family from Central America, and continued to find new opportunities to welcome people from places where there was war or crisis going on. So the next family we welcomed was from Ukraine in the aftermath of the beginning of that war. And then after that, began to encounter Venezuelan community members who had come newly to our community. Johnny got to know, I think, the first ones of them and slowly began to develop relationships with them over time. We also were, for a couple of years, a International Rescue Committee community partner, which is a remote placement program under the national office of the International Rescue Committee. And through that program, we resettled 5 families from Syria, Afghanistan, and Venezuela. So Johnny may want to talk more about the Venezuelan and Central South American people we've worked with.
Sure. Thank you. Yep. So in about June 2022, we did start to see the first arrivals of mostly Venezuelan asylum seekers from the southern border. And a lot of times the folks that would arrive here, it's purely just free market economics. There were a lot of jobs here. There still are. We have a labor shortage here in the Flathead Valley. We have a housing shortage. And so what that means is very naturally, when you have single Venezuelan men who come to the country first, that there's a place for them here. It means that they're filling jobs that locals will not work. It means that they are taking advantage of housing arrangements that locals will not take advantage of. And so really that was sort of a really natural progression of people filling, the labor shortage that we have here in the Flathead Valley.
And then, as often happens with immigrants throughout different immigrant populations, once the man comes here and starts to get a job and get more secure, then he often sends it for his family. And so we began to see that second wave of Venezuelan and other South American, primarily people who then began to put down some roots in the community. And children getting enrolled in school and getting to know their neighbors and different things like that. So it was a really different migration than some of the ones our area has seen previously, where it would be, the seasonal cherry workers in the on Flathead Lake or things like that, agriculture, maybe cattle. This was much more of becoming part of the community.
Gotcha. And you might have already alluded to this, but my question is, you work primarily with immigrants and or refugees, or I mean, are you seeing more of the other? What kind of clients are you serving?
Yeah, through the International Rescue Committee, that was the only work that we did with refugees. So, a refugee is someone who is seeking safety from a list of threats of persecution um, outside the country or approved outside the country. An asylum seeker is someone who enters the country and then um, asks for those protections and works through a court process to see if they can get those protections. But so a lot of the people we work with, probably most of the people we work with are asylum seekers. Um, we had that very small pool of like 5 families that were refugees. And then, we work with any kind of immigrant that, because we see ourselves presenting humanitarian assistance. And so honoring the humanity of any kind of immigrant, but most of them are asylum seekers.
Great. Thank you for that explanation. I think our listeners will appreciate that. My next question for you is there a lot of community involvement with the work that you do? Are there a lot of volunteers or people just within the Flathead community that are participating in events? What does it look like if there is community involvement?
One thing that we've really seen is when we put out a call to the community, whether it would be for financial assistance for a specific need that's arisen, or whether it would be when we welcome a refugee family, and there's a very specific list of things that you have to provide as a community partner. And so we put those things out, and I swear the items that we get within like 3 days, 4 days. If all the stuff we need for a house, and the financial asks that we put out, like here's this urgent financial need that we have, and we usually can fill those pretty quickly as well, which I feel is just a really strong engagement with what we're doing. Uh, um, I think it really shows how much the community does want immigrants here, despite some of the negative voices. And I mean, I don't mean to diminish; those are very serious problems that we have, and especially now. But there is also a strong voice of people who want immigrants here. Johnny, you might have more you want to say about that. That's a little more nuanced.
Sure, yeah. So, I think, especially in a place like the Flathead, and maybe to an extent in various parts of Montana, um, we really focus on sort of the negative voices of people who don't want immigrants or sort of espouse sort of the untruths about immigration. But really what we see is that the support that we have on a community level is much stronger. It's just not as vocal.
Mhm.
And so there's sort of a disconnect in the community as far as the Flathead Valley may not be a welcoming place for immigrants, but behind the scenes, we do have a very diverse group of support that are very supportive of what we do and are very welcoming of different types of immigrants here into the community.
One thing we do is we visit a lot of churches. Johnny and I will go and we'll speak. So we should say we're not a religious organization and we're not a political organization focused on the humanitarian thing. But there's a lot of value overlap with things like churches and civic groups. And so we will often go and speak there and answer questions. And that often will result in people who want to follow what we do or donate or maybe volunteer, do something like that. So
That's great. That's good to hear. I know, of course, you see the negative headlines in the news. You don't always hear about, in the news, the positivity and the folks that are volunteering and engaged and eager to help and welcome people into the community. So I think that's refreshing to hear. My next question for you is, What has the last 5 months looked like for your organization, and how has a change in the administration changed your work, if it has at all?
So things have really become much more urgent. What we've seen on the national level is we have seen the new government proactively trying to sort of rip the carpet out from under people as far as their legal statuses or protections. So again, we've seen things like that with temporary protected status for a variety of groups, so TPS. We've seen the cancellation of, humanitarian parole programs. Um, we've seen, the cancellation of visas and things like that. And so the urgency has really stepped up. On a local level, we have seen maybe concerning police activity, various law enforcement agencies here in the Flathead. Each law enforcement agency is very unique and different, and they all have their very own specific approaches, some of whom I think are acting very much in good faith, others are not. And so, again, it's being very cognizant about your surroundings, making sure that you have all your things in order, and really just doing the best that you can to protect yourself.
Are your clients, the folks you're working with, are they nervous right now?
Yes. Well, I was just going to say how sad I find it that for a lot of people, they're escaping situations of war, trauma, gangs, persecution politically. They've made a tremendous journey through very difficult circumstances. They've often drained any financial resource they may have to try to reach the right here, then they've often engaged in the legal processes they were asked to engage in, whether it be the humanitarian parole, their TPS, or the filing for asylum, working with a lawyer. And they thought, okay, now I have my work permit, I have my social security number. Now I'm going to take a deep breath. I'm going to be safe. My family's going to be safe and secure for a while. And so suddenly, now they're facing a situation where they just come to me bewildered, like, we're not bad people. We weren't committing crimes. We did the things we were supposed to do. I'm so confused. And I'm just seeing people be re-traumatized. And for really just the cruelest reasons possible. These aren't people that are causing problems in the community. They're good folks who are helping to meet a lot of needs in the community, actually, and we're just torturing them. So.
Okay. So can you tell us a little bit about, is it Becker Rengifo del Castillo, and how your organization was involved in advocating for him? And if you don't mind telling folks who might not be familiar with who he is and his story, just bringing us up to date with that.
Sure. Yeah, be happy to. So just a real quick overview. So again, we've had Venezuelans, particularly arriving into the Flathead since June of 2022. And so what that means is that, these are members of the community. And now they've been here about 3 years, many people. And so I personally began to get involved with relatives of Becker Rengifo del Castillo in about probably August of 2022. One of his relatives was here. And I believe in October of 2022, the Cuban, Haitian, Venezuelan, Nicaraguan sponsorship program, which is a humanitarian parole program, opened up. And as you can imagine, lots of Venezuelans in our area were very keen to get other community members. So you either have to be a citizen or you had to be a permanent resident to be able to sponsor individuals. And so, I had really the great pleasure of sponsoring, several individuals, Ukrainians and Venezuelans, into the country. And one of the people that I was able to file an application for was Becker Rengifo del Castillo. And, luckily he was able to come over in the summer of last year, and he's been here in the community ever since. What we saw, it all started out very normal. Becker was driving through Whitefish, leaving work just like anyone else in the Flathead does, and was pulled over for a tail light. And after being pulled over for a tail light, for whatever reason, and I can certainly get into what my opinion is on that, that police officer decided to call Border Patrol for whatever reason. And unfortunately, that cascaded into him being arrested by Border Patrol, moved across the country to Tacoma and held for 6 days, eventually being released without any sort of charges or any record of his detainment, or any explanation as to why he was detained. It's important to remember that Mr. Renjifo has and continues to have a valid Montana driver's license, car insurance, really all the proper documentation on him. So it's really a mystery as to why Whitefish decided to call Border Patrol.
Is that legal to be detained without any specific? I mean, I know you guys are not his attorney, but is that legal? It doesn't even sound legal.
Yeah. So not being an attorney, I can't necessarily give a great legal opinion. It sounds very counter to, our American values. I don't think, as a lay advocate, I can't imagine why we would deprive anyone, immigrant or not, of their freedom, really without any sort of cause.
And it's also important to say we had significant community activism around this. And a lot of that came from the group Flathead Democracy. They were kind of on the front lines of that advocacy, and where we were doing a lot of behind the scenes types of things and with lawyers and stuff. But I did go that first night when there was a large protest at Border Patrol and Whitefish, and numerous times community members, including myself, tried to go and say he has status. He should not be detained. Why are you detaining him? And it was just such a wall. For a while, we couldn't even. We actually were able to get a lawyer willing to represent him, but had a terrible time getting Border Patrol to actually allow them to talk. So, we ended up outside. People started chanting to sign the G28 form, which was going to allow for his legal representation. And he actually heard people outside chanting that. And because of that, signed the form and was able to speak to a lawyer. But even then, he was still sent to Tacoma. Just so many attempts to try to say this is not what should be done. And, the impression that people kept just giving us is, we know best, and it's like, well, no, but like, we know the person, we know the status, and this is not correct. And, I think our opinion was vindicated when he was released. But I do wonder if he hadn't had such a groundswell of advocacy and support and people who were rooting for him, what would have happened? Would he have ended up in one of these terrible places the Trump administration is sending people? It's not completely impossible.
That's a really good point. What would have happened if it weren't for all the advocacy around him? And I'm sure, Montana, maybe we don't have as many immigrants. I wonder what it's like in other states where this is happening as well, and maybe don't have as many people advocating, for every single person that's getting detained illegally.
Yeah, and we don't have the same relational connection to every person who's been detained here in the Flathead. We're trying to keep an eye out for things, especially for things that may be contra justice or the law. But every person is a person that matters. And
what can we be doing right now in the state of Montana? I guess this is an opportunity for a call to action. People who are hearing this right now, and maybe for the first time, are upset and outraged and angry. What can we do with this energy, and how can we be supportive of our immigrant communities across the state?
Yeah, thank you. I think one of those items is, there's definitely a time for hand wringing, but there's definitely a time for, action. Um, it's really important to remember, especially with the case of Mr. Rengifo del Castillo, that started on the local level.
Mhm.
The local police department and that officer made a very, very deliberate, discretionary choice, using, pretty much racial profiling to call Border Patrol. And so part of the action is you really need to start on the ground level in your community to make sure that that domino effect just never even starts. So that means, working with your city councils, working with your county commissioners, being obnoxious, being proactive, you don't give up. And so really advocating that these local law enforcement entities do not collaborate with ICE, or they do not collaborate with Border Patrol. That's really the best place to begin. Another item is there are immigration advocacy groups really throughout the whole state, for the most part. So if you're in the Flathead, or if you're in Missoula, or if you're in Bozeman, connecting with those groups and asking what the needs are. I know here in the Flathead, again, everybody, asking for money is not glamorous, but, asking for money and receiving money means that we're able to connect people with legal resources. And having access to an immigration attorney really does up the chances of a really sort of successful um, immigration process for a lot of people. So donating your time, donating your money, protesting at city council, demanding that your city council take action, talking to your police departments to make sure that they're not collaborating in a negative way with Border Patrol. Those are really some great ways to get started.
Great. And I should ask, because I know that listeners will be interested. How's Becker doing today? Is he back at work? Is he doing all right? Has he recovered, I guess, from this traumatic event?
Yeah. So I think he's doing great. He's in good spirits. He's in good spirits. He very much appreciates being part of the community and the community support that he received. On a larger scale, I think it's important to point out this interaction very particularly has really eroded public trust in law enforcement here in the county. So again, in this example, it was Whitefish Police Department, but that reflects on all sort of law enforcement. And it's not just immigrants. So immigrants will look at this case and they do, it's not hyperbole. People know who Becker is. They know him personally, and they say, this is somebody who had all of his documentation on hand, and the municipal police officer chose to subject him to the dangers of Border Patrol. And that really ripples through the entire immigrant community and, people who support immigrants. Just as an example, we had a gentleman whose car was stolen. So he's the victim of a property crime under the jurisdiction of the sheriff. And when they recovered his car, instead of using the dial-in interpretation services, the sheriff's department said, well, we're going to call Border Patrol so that we can have an interpreter on hand. So then Border Patrol shows up in a predominantly Latino area. Everybody is very aware of that. And so again, the message is, okay, so even if you are the victim of a crime and you report it to a law enforcement agency here in the Flathead, is Border Patrol also just going to show up randomly? And, again, that ripples down to even somebody like me. If I know that somebody has been the victim of a crime, am I going to advocate with that person to report that to law enforcement? That's really bad for everybody in the community.
Yeah, for sure. I didn't even think of that and how that would affect, obviously, their personal safety, but then public safety in general within communities if you're not reporting crimes because you're afraid of Border Patrol coming in. It's not good for the community as a whole. Well, we thank you guys both again for being on the Blue Bench podcast today. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners will have a lot to take away as well. So thanks again.